Shalom, family, and welcome back to another episode of Imuna in Exertion. I'm your host, Gabrielle Naomi. Before we begin, let's talk about Abib that is right around the corner, marking not only the beginning of Passover, but also the start of the new year, as written in Exodus 12:2. This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Since Passover is coming up, I want to break down the exact timeline that Messiah followed, because when we align his steps with Exodus 12 and the rest of Torah, along with the Besorah, the Gospels, we see the full picture, right? From Messiah instructing Peter to prepare for Passover in the evening, Luke 22 verse 8, and he sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." To him, sitting down to eat the meal with his disciples, Luke 22 verse 14 and 15, when the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them with fervent desire, "I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Then later that night, he went to the garden to pray in Matthew 26, verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." Before being captured and brought before the Pharisees. By morning, he was taken to Pilate, which in John 18:28 says, "Then he led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And they refused to enter his hall so they wouldn't be defiled before the Passover." By the afternoon, Messiah was hung on the tree, gave up his spirit in Matthew 27, verse 50, and Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit, and was buried in the evening in haste, following the commands in Exodus 12:10. "You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire," because the high Sabbath of unleavened bread was approaching, when no work can be done, which states in Leviticus 23 verse 6 and 7. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy conviction. You shall do no customary work on it. And just as he prophesied in Matthew 12 verse 40, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." He was in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, rising on Shabbat. This is the calendar that Yahweh God has given us. We must continue to study all of Scripture to have full context and understanding. Let's dive in and connect it with what it means for us as we prepare for the Passover season. Today, we are diving deep into week 6. Cannot believe we made it this far, already into week 6 of our devotional series. We're going to be focusing on the book of Romans, specifically Romans 3:31. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. Romans 3:31. This verse brings us to a powerful truth that faith and obedience are not in opposition. They actually work together in perfect harmony. Many today misunderstand grace, thinking that it replaces obedience. But Paul makes it very crystal clear that faith does not cancel the law. It actually upholds it. Okay? Today, we're going to be going over 1, the balance of grace and obedience in covenant living, 2, building wealth and stewarding resources for the kingdom, and 3, living out faith in practical ways. Okay? So let's get into it. Here is the balance of grace and obedience in covenant living that can show us as believers that we often hear 2 extremes, very two high extremes. One side claims that we are under grace and that obedience to God's commandments no longer matters. The other side stiffly follows the law but forgets the role of faith. Yet, Scripture teaches us balance. So, let's look at our forefathers, the 12 tribes of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were chosen to walk in covenant with Yah. Okay? When they obeyed, they prospered. When they disobeyed, they faced judgment. Think about our ancestors in Egypt. They cried out for deliverance, and Yah, in His grace, redeemed them. But after being saved, He gave them Torah, His instructions for righteous living. Why? Because obedience is the evidence of faith. In James 2:26, he says, faith without works is dead. The works that James refers to are not just good deeds, but it's the obedience to Yah's laws. Paul echoes this in Romans 3:31. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. Paul echoes it very loud in Romans 3:31. So faith establishes the law, right? It doesn't remove it. We now see this is in the history of our people. When Israel upheld the covenant, we were blessed beyond measure. But when we abandoned Yah's commandments, we were scattered among the nations. So how do we find balance? We rest in Yah's grace, but also walk in obedience, honoring His commandments, not for salvation, but because we are saved. This is so beautiful. All praise to Yahweh that the balance is literally just resting in His grace, but you will need to walk in obedience. That is starting by honoring His commandments because we're saved. We have that, right? Okay, so now building wealth and stewarding resources for the kingdom. Let's talk about the wealth, okay? Many of us have been taught that poverty is godly, and I have actually can say like almost every episode that we talk about is I feel like I've been a witness to a lot of this, and we've been taught that poverty is godly, and I said, okay, oh wow, look, just think about it, okay? But the truth is, Yah desires His people to prosper, not for selfish gain, but for kingdom purpose. Look at Abraham, right? The father of our faith. He was wealthy in livestock, silver, and gold. Genesis 13:2, right? Then we have Joseph, the tribe of Ephraim. He became second in command in Egypt. He was managing the nation's resources during a famine. Then look at King Solomon from the tribe of Judah. He was blessed with immense wisdom and riches. But here's the key. Their wealth was tied to obedience and purpose, right? Deuteronomy, once again, 8:18 will always remind us, and you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant. Yah gives us wealth to establish His covenant and to support our families, uplift our communities, and expand the kingdom. Like, that is the most beautiful opportunity. However, Many of us are truly called to be kingdom financiers, whether that's going to be through business, investments, or any type of creative works, but we must always steward our resources very wisely, right? So let's just ask ourselves, and I truly ask myself these questions almost every day, probably every hour at this point. Am I managing my finances in a way that honors Yah? Or I'll ask myself, am I sowing into the kingdom? Then I'll ask myself, am I preparing for the generational wealth just as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did, right? Because faith that works includes obedience in how we handle the resources, our resources. So now here is how we can live out our faith in practical ways, because faith isn't just something we believe, right? It's something we live. So our ancestors, of course, the 12 tribes of Israel, they each had unique roles, okay? Some were warriors like Gad, and some were the priests like Levi, and others were skilled in trade like Zebulun, but each tribe contributed to the nation as a whole. That is how God has us designed. Likewise with our faith, because that is going to manifest in daily actions. Look at it this way. Obedience in speech, okay? Do our words reflect Yah's wisdom? Look at it as obedience in relationships. Are we treating others with love and righteousness? And then you can look at it with obedience in our work. Are we genuinely using our gifts for the kingdom? You know, Colossians 3:23 reminds us, and whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men. A faith that works is faith that moves and obeys and that builds and that gives and that serves. Okay, so here are my questions I have for you, so we can take a moment to reflect. Okay, how does obedience deepen your faith, right? So for example, consider the times Yah has called you to step out in obedience, and how did your faith grow in those moments? Think about it. Yah had called you to step out in obedience, and you know it was God. How did your faith grow in those moments when you did? And last, I want to ask, in what areas of your life do you need to surrender more to Yah? Right? Is it your finances? Is it your relationships? Is it your business? What is Yah asking you to yield to Him? Take some time this week to sit with these questions in prayer and just ask Him, and He'll reveal it to you. So family, I do want to say that a little recap. Today we were able to uncover in this episode of the Passover. Abib is around the corner, the beginning of the new year in God's calendar, and how faith and obedience are not separate. They actually equally work together. We also talked about how Yah gives wealth to establish His covenant, and also living faith is an active faith, right? So let's just remember Romans 3:31. Doesn't say the law is void, okay? On the contrary, faith does establish the law. So we can now walk in obedience, not out of obligation, but because we love Yah and we trust His ways, right? Thank you so much, you guys, for tuning in. If this episode blessed you, be sure to share it with a friend. And if you want to stay connected, check out the show notes for our links to the Moon Restoration Ministries, Instagram, Facebook, website, and other ways to support our mission, okay? Until next time, family, just keep walking in faith and obedience. Shalom.